Now, I should make one thing absolutely clear. I was in Hungary a few months ago, and the sentiment amongst people in Hungary was, we're in the European Union, and we will stay here. We're not leaving. We are surrounded by European territory. We're in the center of Europe. It doesn't make any sense for us to leave. But they were also, and I think this goes beyond the government, by the way, getting very, very frustrated by what they see as a combination of extreme overreach by the European Centre, by the Commission and the various European institutions, and their constant interference in Hungarian affairs, and the way in which the centre, the EU Centre, is taking powers to itself and making decisions which are not agreed to by the people of the sovereign states. And also the way in which the EU Centre uses this power, which it gives itself, not just arrogantly, but incompetently, that in fact the whole structure of the European Union has gone far beyond its original purpose, what it was originally designed to do, which is basically to set up good economic conditions between European nations to enable them to trade and to live peacefully with each other, a kind of attempt to set up a state, if you like, a kind of United States of Europe by stealth. Europe is, of course, completely different from the United States. So as a project anyway, that is misconceived, but that is combined with extraordinary arrogance and ineptitude. And I was hearing lots of complaints, for example, about the way in which the European Centre simply does not understand, for example, Hungary's energy needs, its agricultural needs, problems like that, and tries to impose solutions on Hungary, which are unacceptable in terms of Hungary's interests. And of course, it has all sorts of ideas on social policy, on, all the identity issues that we know about, which a conservative Christian country like Hungary doesn't welcome.
And in fact, I want to stick on that issue. You mentioned energy. That was also one of the other big things that both men mentioned in their press conference, is that they say, listen, right now, they actually called out Ukraine. They said Ukraine is a block right now because they're preventing inexpensive gas from coming in, gas that costs us much more to get elsewhere. So it's rising the cost of us to do business, which has a dampening effect on our economies. And we want to get that fixed. So if the EU is supposed to be existing to help economically, then having this, I would say, go so far as to say rabid anti-Russianism is actually costing the European Union. How do others see this?
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct. And of course, it's not just Hungary and Slovakia that are complaining about this. If you go to Southern Europe, which is where ultimately I come from, I am by ethnicity Greek, and I was born in Greece. So, I know Southern Europe very well. I know Greece, I know Italy very well too. There, people have a completely different perspective on the whole issue of the conflict with Russia. And Southern Europe historically has been very loyal to the EU project, to the European project. I mean, they were there at its creation in the case of Italy, but they too are becoming increasingly frustrated. And of course, Italy was a major importer of Russian gas, and that has stopped, and that's caused major problems for Italy's industrial base. And again, they find that the EU Centre simply isn't responsive to all of Italy's concerns or Southern Europe's concerns. Immigration, by the way, is another issue. I mean, there's an enormous amount of illegal immigration across the Mediterranean Sea. I think it is fair to say that people in Southern Europe see this as a more pressing issue than the threat from Russia, which they simply don't believe in. And in Southern Europe, anyway, they have a different perspective towards Russia. Greece, Italy, you will find much of the media, for example, is much more open to ideas about the conflict with Russia than you would find in, say, Germany or Britain or even France. So the Italians, the Greeks, the Spanish, others are becoming increasingly tired and weary and feel that they're not being listened to. There is a real possibility that if this conflict continues for very, very much longer, in the direction that it is going, especially if the United States sorts itself out and finally makes a decision whether it is in favor of peace and reconciliation with Russia, then at that point there could be a split. And I don't think that's something to be discounted. And I can tell you for an absolute fact that there are many people in the Commission, with which I know quite a lot about, and in the EU governments, that they're very, very concerned about this. That if the United States, for example, were by any chance to start relaxing sanctions, then South and Central European governments would unite and demand in the European Council that the EU starts to do the same, and might start vetoing the rollover of sanctions, which has to take place every 6 months.
So if the European elite, who were in charge of the EU, if they want to succeed, and if they want to maintain the unity of the body, it seems that at some point they're going to have to change course here, because as you and I've talked several times, but I want to reiterate here, there is militarily no outcome other than Russia will win this war, whether it's through negotiations or through conquest on the battlefield, even if that took another year plus. And I think that it's not out of the question that it could. I doubt that it could go much longer than the summer, just because I don't think the Ukrainian army can sustain that, regardless of the supplies that come in. But at one point or another, they're going to lose. If the European Union does what let's say Mark Rutte the other day, who's the NATO Secretary General, but he seemed to echo the mentality in the EU that there won't be any normalizing anything with Russia for the time being, because they have turned into the enemy and all this kind of stuff. All that does is make it harder for yourself, and it keeps this potential pressure up for a conflict later on. How can they resolve that seemingly dissonance between taking a policy that helps them and fostering a policy that can only harm them?
The great difficulty with what you said, which is entirely rational, by the way, and makes complete sense if what you're interested in is the long-term future of the European Union and of Europe. The great problem is that, of course, the EU Centre has been pursuing over the last actually 10 or so years a rather different project, which is not European harmony, if you like, but European integration. And they have used this crisis with Russia as a mechanism to accelerate greatly that process of EU integration. So the EU Centre is now involved in energy policy, which it wasn't 3 years ago. It is involved in deciding, whether Russian airlines can fly over EU airspace, which again, it wasn't 3 years ago. It can decide all kinds of things: sanctions policy, monetary policy. It is using the crisis to try to float the idea of Eurobonds. That's to say, bonds like treasury bonds, but issued by the European Union itself, not by the member states, to finance the EU budget. And there's even talk about European armies and European tax collecting and all that kind of thing. Now, if you are focused on achieving that objective, which, as I said, is EU integration, then, of course, you need a crisis in order to move that process forward. And, of course, the danger with using crisis in that way, by the way, this is a well-known, one of the founders of the European Union, Jean Monnet, actually said that Europe needs a crisis every so often in order to move the process of integration just one step further. So that's what they've been doing with this particular crisis. But of course, it's a dangerous game to play, because ultimately a crisis can make you, but it can also break you. And this crisis is bigger than any other one that we've had up to now, including, by the way, the financial crisis of 2008, which I saw one of your viewers allude to.
Yeah, and certainly there's a lot of risk of that going much worse. A lot of really troubling signs on the near term horizon here in the United States for our economy. These This trade war with China is no bueno. That is not helping anything here, and could exacerbate a lot of these situations. And there's some indicators that show we might even be already in the first elements of a recession, which we'll have to wait another quarter to have that either validated or refuted. But the bottom line is things are not really in great shape financially. Given the fragility of that, and of course, what happens here happens in Europe, and so it's kind of all connected with this globalism issue. Then it again seems like it's not a smart idea to keep pushing and poking the Russia issue. And the latest one I've seen is it was on the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense released a video a couple of days ago by a German officer who said, "Hey, we're moving 5,000 troops in to defend every inch of NATO territory further closer to the Russian border." While we're still talking about trying to bring this one to an end, it seems that the Europeans are wanting to keep poking and keeping the threat of military conflict alive. How do those things go together?
Well, absolutely. Can I just say, I mean, one of the things that has gone seriously wrong in Europe over the last 20 years is that the Baltic states and some of the other East European states, which have entirely understandable historical issues with Russia, which, anybody who knows their history will understand, have managed to exert a disproportionate influence over European policy. At some point, in some way, they managed to forge an alliance with the European Centre in order to try to impose their own policies on Europe. And they've been doing this, unfortunately, in a very, very negative way. And we see that a disproportionate number of people who work in the EU Centre, like Kaja Kallas, the High Representative, are drawn from this part of the world with these kind of attitudes. Now, the problem is that, as you absolutely correctly say, with respect to Russia, these views are not realistic. They are not realistic in terms of the interests of the countries that we are talking about, because if the Russians win a military victory in Ukraine, then, of course, their position is going to become more vulnerable in some respects, not less, if you have an angry, rearmed Russia on your border. But of course, it is also a problem for these countries if European unity also becomes strained, which it is. You can see that every single day, and that is increasing. And the problem is, again, this attempt to militarize, to deploy forces constantly to Eastern Europe, to try to get Germany to move battalions or brigades and things of this kind. It works in the sense that it gives these countries the sense that Europe is indeed behind us. We're facing this Russian colossus, but we're not alone. But it's also very deceptive and dangerous in the end, because their long-term future, their prospects, their material prosperity depends ultimately on a good relationship with Russia. They can't be constantly on guard against a giant next door who, might eventually become generally antagonistic to them because they are so antagonistic towards that giant. And of course, relying on the United States is also dangerous, given that the United States, if I could just throw in the United States, is a continent and an ocean away and is a global superpower with responsibilities all around the world. So you're relying too much on that country and you're neglecting the giant next door who is literally on your doorstep and who is in a position to start doing things at any moment. And when I say start doing things, I don't just mean, military action, which is perhaps the least that the Russians, it's the last thing I think that the Russians would want to do. But they can do all kinds of things with economic pressures and all sorts of things, which they haven't done up to now.
And also the Russians could move in the other direction, and they could improve relations, because they still, to this day, both Lavrov, Peskov, Putin, they all say, we would rather get this whole matter settled and get back to improving relations across the board. Aren't there constituencies in Europe that say, let's don't be stupid in keeping this antagonistic deal, which is going to cost an $800 billion build up the defense issue. And instead, how's about we worry about lowering the tension so that we don't need to have any kind of military buildup and that we can live in more peace? Isn't there any move in Europe for that?
Well, first of all, I mean, you mentioned Orban and Fico. I mean, they're absolutely already clear that this is absolutely the way to go. You will find that view also expressed in other Central European states, in the Czech Republic. This is increasingly strongly expressed in Croatia as well. It's also starting to gain traction in southern Italy, in southern Europe, in Italy, in Greece. But the country where we've now finally begun to see that argument break through is Germany. In Germany, a party, the AfD, is now the most popular party. And of course, it supports a agreement, a restoration of normal relations with Russia. But perhaps what's even more interesting is that we're starting to see the business community in Germany starting to speak out for the first time since the start of this crisis. The chemical industry say we need cheap Russian pipeline gas in order to be competitive and in order to survive. And you also see some of the minister presidents of some of the East German states. These are not AfD minister presidents. These are people who belong to the CDU, which will soon be the ruling party. Anyway, they're now coming out and saying that it's time to start speaking to the Russians and start building a relationship with them. It's still very early days. And I have to say that in Germany, which is the swing country, the mainstream, especially within the CDU, remains solidly committed to the policy of hostility to Russia. But with every day that passes, this line starts to crack. And again, a few weeks ago, there was a furious row at one of the European Council meetings in which the Prime Minister of Spain, a southern European country, Mr. Sanchez, came out and said, look, it's time that we began negotiations with the Russians. We need to appoint a high representative to go to Russia and to speak on our behalf and to see whether things, yeah, absolutely, that's what he said. And Kaja Kallas, who was the high representative, said, well, you know, why should we appoint such a person? Am I not the high representative already? And, you know, it then evolved into an outright row between the two. And then
I'll have to go look that up.
Exactly. It's then postponed to another meeting. And then, of course, it all came to nothing because Macron, the French president, proposed himself as the person who would then be the European Union's leader in diplomacy with Russia. And nobody was prepared to disagree. I mean, I don't think he was voted exactly. But of course, since then, he's done absolutely nothing. But you can see that there is this start. People are starting to talk. The Russians say that they're getting whispers from some countries. Putin, by the way, said yesterday that they know that most people in Europe, what is many people in Europe, disagree with the existing policy. Putin, by the way, in that speech he made yesterday, also said exactly what you said just now, that one day the Russians look forward to a restoration of relations with Europe. I think this process is going to take quite a long time.